I'd like to welcome you to this year's OGS Crawford Lecture, an annual lecture in the Hampshire Field Club calendar, has been for many years. And it's there to give us a chance to remember a man who did so much for archaeology in general, but particularly for archaeology in Hampshire, having worked at the Ordnance Survey in Southampton for many years, and sort of launched his interest in aerial photography from this county as well, literally. But also to remind us just how many connections, much he did to widen public interest in archaeology in the time that he was working. And that's part of the point of this talk, is that it's offered for free to encourage people to perhaps hear a bit more about archaeology who might not normally go to archaeological lectures. This is a chance to come to one for nothing and try it out. And if anyone is coming along to one of these for the first time and isn't a member of the Field Club already, then we'd obviously really welcome you as members. And so there are plenty of membership forms on our website. That's the easiest way to join. OGS Crawford's interests were so broad, it's not usually a problem to find a topic for his talk that he didn't have some involvement in. And certainly this evening's talk is no exception to that. He was clearly very interested in the Cerne Abbas Giant. He was also interested in the dating of it and frustrated by people's attempts to date it using methods that he didn't really approve of, to judge by the things he said in the Antiquity Journal that he set up and edited for many years. So I'm sure he would be extremely delighted and would like to have been here to hear this evening's talk from Dr. Mike Allen, leading environmental archaeologist, known to many of you already because he's been working in this area for quite a long time. Quite a long time now.
Yes, 30 plus years.
Yes, since coming to Southampton as a student to do his PhD. So I am, of course, author of the textbook in this area, Molluscs in Archaeology, and there happen to be a few copies of that. Do dip into your pockets for that. So may I hand over to you, Mike?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's slightly awe-inspiring to be lecturing with Crawford up on my first slide. He was a great observer of archaeology. He was a great observer of the landscape. And one thing that our work at the Cerne Abbas has taught us is that we need to observe the landscape carefully. And people who willy-nilly draw sketches and make comments will soon fall by the wayside. So this was a piece of work which is I think that Crawford would have enjoyed. It was a case of observation, clinical thinking, scientific clinical excavation, and coming up at the end of the day with an answer. The project, there he is, the Cerne Abbas Giant, proudly displaying himself on the hillside in Dorset, where he has done for many hundreds or thousands of years. Archaeologists have written about him, talked about him, drawn illustrations of him, and pontificated about his date. In fact, there's even a whole book here led by Tim Darvill and co, where they had a debate in Cerne Abbas itself, discussing who he was and what date he was. And I need to say that was wrong. But so was I. But the Cerne Abbas Giant was owned by the Pitt Rivers estate. And in the 1920s, the Pitt Rivers family gave it to the National Trust. And Martin Papworth, the archaeologist of the National Trust, thought, wouldn't it be good to actually knock this on the head and date it so we could actually date him for their centenary year of ownership? So on that premise, we'll start. So, first of all, the giant isn't sitting alone. He sits in a landscape, typically with lots of archaeology. You can see humps and bumps here, but here is the abbey of Cerne Abbas itself. ancient barn here, earthworks up here of prehistoric dates probably. And so he's sitting on a hillside, although he looks remarkably alone. When you see him from the front, he's actually in a landscape which is inhabited by lots of things from the past. Here he is, sitting here, and just above him is the trendle, or the frying pan, which is a rectilinear enclosure, undated, but probably Iron Age, or possibly Romano-British. There he is sitting on the landscape with the trendle above him, and the abbey to his side. He's been drawn and sketched since the 18th century. And here we can see drawings of him. And it's quite interesting to have a look at those drawings slightly more carefully. So at one point, somebody suggested there was a cloak or a head over his outstretched arm, because his outstretched arm is just hanging there as if it's leading away, guiding away, or perhaps holding something. So the suggestion was there that this is a severed head or a cloak he's holding. But also, if we look at them carefully, there's a band going around the top of his legs. Is that where they're trying to depict the top of his legs? Or is it a belt? Or is it indicating that he's wearing trousers? There are other figures in the British landscape. So the Long Man of Wilmington in Sussex, not far from where I used to live as a kid, and the Cerne Abbas, the two main humanoid figures in the British landscape. The giant's first depiction was in 1764. Here we can see him sketched out with measurements, which are quite accurate and quite detailed, showing the giant in 1764. And until we started this research in 2020, that was the earliest known record of him, bar discussion of that in 1763. However, as a result of our work, a local historian got off his backside, actually started looking through the records and found an earlier record of him reported from a church warden in Cerne itself. Some drawings from the first drawing, not very good. The second drawing, really quite accurate. But the church warden's record is 100 years before, 1694. So quite a leap forward. And that's Brian Edwards published that in 220 or 221 in Cerne Archaeology. People have also gone on about his member. I'm quite excited about that. The Gents magazine, which recorded it quite graphically. Hutchins in 1774 was a bit more prudish and decided to remove it. And at later stages, we can see from modesty, it wasn't there. It's also quite interesting that when Flinders Petrie recorded him, he seemed to have grown in 1926. Between then and 1764, he'd grown 6 feet in size. So obviously the Dorset air was doing him good. Or in fact, what had happened is that the figure is changing shape slowly, which is also a point that we should think about as he's been managed or mismanaged. Various aspects of him are changing. So his navel, which once stood quite clearly here, is now incorporated into the top of his member. So they're all things just remind us that he has sat on a hillside, but he isn't static. This thing happened to him. So white figures, chalk figures, they're notoriously difficult to date because there's nothing associated with them. There are no pits, no rubbish, no bones, no charcoal, no pottery. They're just figures on the landscape. And also, as we'll see, they're all very different. However, David Miles from the Oxford unit cleverly went out to the Uffington White Horse and dug a hole in him and dated him with optically stimulated luminescence, OSL. This is a technique that looks at quartz grains or silica grains and measures the last time they saw light. When they're buried, they start decaying. The luminescence in them decays. You can measure how much is left and work out how old they are. So David Miles did this for the Uffington White Horse, and the Uffington White Horse there he is leaping across the Berkshire Downs, looking very much like a stylized horse, or in fact looking very similar to Iron Age coinage. On the back of Iron Age coinage, you'll see a horse almost identical to this leaping across the back of the coins. And the date is late Bronze Age, early Iron Age in perfect fitting with that. So there we have chalk figures. So perhaps all chalk figures are really prehistoric. That's what I used to believe. So the Oxford Archaeology then decided in 1998 to go and do the same thing at the Cerne Abbas Giant, but they weren't funded, so that never happened. In 2003, the Long Man of Wilmington was then looked at by Martin Bell, and I'll talk to you a bit about that later. And he dated the hill wash underneath him and dated him to the 16th, 17th century. Ironically, the Long Man of Wilmington is sitting on a scarp chalk face overlooking the Weald, and at his left hand, there is Wilmington Priory. Just as the Cerne Abbas sits on the Dorset landscape, at his left hand, there is the Cerne Abbey. So here is the giant given to the National Trust. The Pitt Rivers family got rid of him. In some ways, they're quite pleased to, because in order to keep him there on the hillside, you have to maintain him. And it's quite hard work and quite expensive. So it was a gift which came with the prerequisite that here you are, now you look after him, which they did. So on that basis, Martin Papworth, who should take all the credit for this, decided to go out and date him. Archaeologists had spent ages pontificating about his date, and yet not one archaeologist, Crawford, Fox, anyone else, had actually gone ahead and tried to date him other than on stylistic views. There are lots of papers and suggestions about stylistically how he relates to this god, this deity, to Hercules. There are suggestions being bandied around that, oh, perhaps it's Cromwell, perhaps it's someone taking the mickey out of Cromwell. That's something that my historian colleague would wish we don't ever mention again, because he said it's rubbish. So Martin Papworth said, we'll put it all to bed, and the National Trust will excavate it, find out the result, and in July, August of that year, 220, we go to the Cerne Abbas Village Hall and announce to the villagers and the rest of the world what date he was. So there he is. And if we look at this volume here, it is a little bit grey in the middle, but essentially it fits into two camps, the prehistoric camp and the 17th century or 18th century later date camp. So two sets of archaeologists and historians who either say he's prehistoric, Bronze Age, Iron Age, or those who think he's historic. And when we start this, I won't deny, I put myself in Tim's camp and said he was prehistoric. I went on telly and said that, and I still thought until nearly when the date came back that he was going to be prehistoric. But we found out slightly before the dates that he wasn't. Here's the book. So the Rude Man of Dorset, as it's called, the excavation was led by Martin Papworth. I did the scientific stuff, but the excavation was done by the National Trust staff and volunteers. Everyone who's interested could come along and help. However, it all started in about 2000 when I was asked by the BBC to join Aubrey Manning up there and examine the hill wash, because they wanted to date him but weren't allowed to dig any holes. And I said, oh, it's easy. What we do is we go down to the giant, we look at the bottom of the slope, we look for hill wash. I know about hill wash. I've been studying hill wash since I was a schoolboy, literally. I directed an excavation of hill wash when I was meant to be doing my A-levels. Hence, I missed my biology A-level. Ironically. And I said, what we do is we find some hill wash. The hill wash would have come off the slope when there's been activity on the slope. So when prehistoric people cleared the slope, soils and road would get hill wash. When people then cleared the scrub off here and painted or cut in the giant, there'd be more hill wash, and that hill wash would be slightly chalkier, so we'd be able to identify that. Simple. I have spent at that time 30 years looking around and 20 years looking around the landscape, digging hill wash. So I know all about hill wash. There's only one person who knew more about hill wash in archaeology than me, and that's the person who taught me. So off I went with an auger and a TV crew to go and find the hill wash. I peppered the hill, or the bottom of the hill, with auger holes, and to this day, don't understand why, but I couldn't find any. I looked up a pillock on television as I was explaining to them as I was augering away, oh, this is exactly where the hill wash was, and explained just I have to you how it would all happen, and it wasn't there. I don't know why, but it wasn't. Not at the foot slope, not further out. It's mapped in the geology maps, but anyway, it isn't there. So on that basis, I suggested we go to the Long Man of Wilmington. The BBC crew were happy with that. At the time, my employer said, no, you can't do that. If you want to do that, you'll have to take leave. You have to do it all in your own time. And at that time, I didn't have enough leave left. So I couldn't. So I suggested they contacted Martin Bell, who taught me about hill wash, to go and do it. So he actually went off, another Sussex man, and worked on that. So I was stuck with the giant. So some 19 years later, having proved that I wasn't able to date him through auguring, Martin Papworth came up with the idea and came to me to have a look. So we said, okay, let's have a look. Let's see how we can date him. We need to look at him carefully. We need to look at him in a number of places and see whether we can see that there's anything there to date. After all, he's in a chalk cut figure with chalk exposed on the landscape. So what is there to see? After auguring, we did identify some areas where there might be deposits. If we looked at him, the reason they have to re-chalk him all the time is because the chalk is eroding away here and building up at the bottom of the slope. And can you see this bank here? That bank is not just chalk from his feet and his foot, but that's soil ending up here. This is hill wash. I wasn't allowed to do this because it's a scheduled monument. So when I was going out auguring, I wasn't allowed to augur here. But once we had scheduled monument permission, we could. And here we augured through here and through here. And indeed, there are deposits up to 50, 60, 70, 80 centimeters thick. So we could, one, look at that deposit, excavate it and see whether there's anything in it and date it through ISL. But also, his feet must have gone up because this is now rammed chalk in here to try and keep them clean. And so that must be a stack of rammed chalk. So there's a possibility of dating that as well. Or at least not the chalk, but there's some silica elements within the chalk. So there he is. We decided and asked permission to excavate 4 clinical little slots. They're about 2 meters long by 60 centimeters wide. So we are creating minimal damage to this edifice. Of course, we had doing it in public. We're doing it in a public gaze because we couldn't hide. He's sitting there on the hillside, and so it's slightly obvious that we're there, although we are fenced off, which is the old fence line. The new fence line is rectilinear. 2 meters long by 0.6 meters wide. Small little holes in these locations where we'd found hill wash and the chalkings building up in the crook of the elbow and his 2 feet. So there are the excavations being started. There we can see soil on either side and the chalking, which the Natural Trust have done. As we continue to excavate, it went down and down and down. And here we can see layers of different chalking of rubble, marl, kibbled chalk, that's chalk come up from the river, marl, and this paste, which they rammed in only the year before. And on the upslope side, there's soil, and on the downslope side, there's soil. The great conundrum to a soil scientist, how does that get there? This is hill wash, quite simply washing down the hill and accumulating against the chalked up feet. And so as the soil erodes over the top, so the Natural Trust and everyone else in the past have just added more chalk, therefore changing the aspect, changing the shape, and changing inadvertently the whole image. So this is hill wash, and if we look at it, it's nearly all fine soil, a bit of chalk in there, just come off here. It's nearly all fine soil, so that's just soil washing down the hill from rabbit burrows, from scrapes, and between the grass, like this stuff here. The stuff down slope, what's that? Now that can't be hill wash because hill wash doesn't come along and then jump and go down here. And it took me, ironically, until 2 weeks ago, and I worked out what this was, and I had to rewrite the entire report. This here is a bit of hill wash, but it's soil developing over here. As the soil builds up, there's more soil in the area, so the soil can develop well. It can develop well now, and there isn't so much pressure of downwash and erosion away from it. It will build up as a soil in itself. So this is a colluvial soil, and this is colluvium. They're different, and they have different dates and different formation processes. So the answer's in the soil. No, the answer's in the snails. So here you can see Martin's drawings of all these different layers. of the giants. The giant is not like the Long Man of Wilmington. He's not like some of the chalk horses, which are just scraped clean bits of chalk. He's a combination of scraped chalk and accumulation. And here we can see that deposit on either side, but also the start was with a trench, a cut. So originally they did cut a trench and then fill it in chalk. When? Also, they also have problems with some of it because here is a chestnut paling stake thrust down the side of it to try and keep the soil up, keep the chalk free, whatever. We don't know what date that is, but we suggest that's Pitt Rivers. And there's Martin doing his archaeological work, drawing the sections literally with the stone very carefully. And Martin has then been able to tease out the identification of the rechalking of lots of things. He's rechalked by the National Trust relatively frequently, every 10 years or so. And he's been able to identify this, and he was involved in this one here in 95. And he could recognize the 2008 one, the 95 one. He knew this was the National Trust in Beard. And he knew that this was kibbled chalk, which the National Trust bought in. This is marl, and was able to work out from historical records, which was rich, and there's postulated that this is Pitt Rivers in 1887. So this is when Pitt Rivers gave up the monument. Look how much it's built up since then. And it's a postulation, this one being 1868, based on historical records of the management of that. That's all very well. We know he dates 1868 or before, but we knew that. And here we have this lump of chalk. There are no artifacts in here. There are no artifacts in here. This is the piece of wood, which has often been inserted later. There are no artifacts in here. So we have to use another way of dating it. So we're going to use OSL. However, when we did look at this and compared it with the Uffington White Horse, we can see there are similarities. The Uffington White Horse too has been rechalked and rechalked, and these are layers of chalk building up against it. So it's given us something about his construction method. And the Long Man of Wilmington isn't actually a chalk figure. It's not the chalk you can see. It's now painted blocks. In the past, it was painted bricks laid on the surface. So if you went along and stole all those bricks, stole all those blocks, the Long Man of Wilmington would no longer survive. And his record in the soil is nothing. So Long Man of Wilmington is different again. So here we can see 3 different figures, 3 different types of construction, although these two are relatively similar. So we date it through OSL, optical stimulated luminescence. And we get this chap, Professor Toms, to come in and do it. And he's looking slightly angst here because he says that we need silica and we need quartz. How much silica and quartz is there in the chalk soils? Well, chalk is calcium carbonate. It is 98% calcium carbonate. The soils that it derives from it are largely chalky. However, there is the flint, which has silica in it. But the flint is not what we're after. We're after minute grains of silica. So he says, you are pushing the boundaries, Mike, again, because I always do that with him. And this is going to be a tough one, but here he is working, taking his samples. He takes samples by bashing tubes into the soil, into our sections, and taking them away and sealing the ends so that no light gets into it. Then he can go to his lab and do his clever stuff. But also he uses this machine here, gamma spectrometer, which he leaves there for about 45 minutes per sample, or an hour per sample, to measure the background radiation, which he uses to calibrate his results. And this means his results become more accurate. But OSL dates are not brilliant, sorry, Mr. Toms, because their error margins are quite wide. So for us archaeologists now getting more and more used to radiocarbon dates with plus or minus 15 and Bayesian statistics, these are a bit sloppy. But on the other hand, archaeologists haven't a foggiest what date he is. They don't know whether he's prehistoric or anything post-Roman is modern to me, so or modern. So this is going to be a way of doing it. So here he is, Martin's brilliant sections, and we persuaded him to take a whole number of samples. We can't afford to date all of them because they cost £1,500 a pop. So we're going to date a few. So we offered to do 2, and he generously offered date 2 more. So he gave us 4 dates. Who we have his elbow and his foot, and elbow and foot. We've taken samples from the chalk itself, from downslope and upslope. Notice we've got downslope, upslope, and the chalk. So I also then sampled for snails, of course, and soil micromorphology, so we can put the giant into the context in which he sat. We can then understand whether the landscape was cleared for him or cleared before him. And we can understand what these deposits here are in terms of their soils. So we did that. The site was backfilled on March 20th to 21. Right? And the ISL samples were taken to Gloucester University by Tom's, and we packed off. And I drove off actually completely covered in chalk with my romper suit, my green jumpsuit on, completely covered in chalk. And I drove off from site for a weekend away on holiday. My wife had to ring up the rather posh hotel we're going to, saying that when I turned up, I did look a mess, but don't worry, I would scrub up. 30 minutes before we arrived, we literally could see the map because we weren't far away. On the radio, which we listened to, there was an announcement. And these were interrupted by the Prime Minister. Blah, 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 COVID, all hotels closed, all restaurants closed, everything closed. Bad news for me and my holiday, because as we arrived, everyone was pouring out. But more bad news for the OSL samples, which are now safely in Gloucester University. Unfortunately, too safely in Gloucester University that they were locked in the lab, and even Professor Toms could not get in and access them, which is what he had hoping to do, but wasn't allowed. So the samples are locked in the lab. So the National Trust realised their announcement of the 100th anniversary ownership of the giant to the village is now going to have to go by the wayside. But nevertheless, although everything did start, some of us could carry on doing our work. I have my own lab at home and I could continue working on this. So we could continue and start seeing at least some of the aspects of the giant. So we know that the Uffington horse, the Long Man of Wilmington, built differently. The Long Man was dated by OSL to AD 1540 to 1710. About the date the Wilmington Priory was changing ownership, and that things were happening there. That was dated via the Hillwash, somewhat annoyingly, because this is exactly what I wanted to do for the Cerne Abbas some 20 years earlier. But it was done by the person who taught me about Hillwash, that's fine. And there is the Uffington White Horse, OSL dated 1380 to 550 BC. So when was our giant made? Even before the OSL results came out, I did the land snail analysis. And this little beastie appeared in all my samples. Land snails are not used for dating. They're used to tell you the environment. However, some snails came in with the Romans. This snail, the garden snail, with all this rain, it's probably eating all your plants now. The Roman snail, Helix, Amatia, is eating your plants, but that was brought in by the Romans, probably to eat, along with the Roman snail, Helix Amatia. Inadvertently, during the medieval period, 3 other species arrived in Britain. They probably came in with the packing, with straw and hay on boats, packing pottery, pottering vessels, with goods being brought across from the continent, and they then went wild in the UK and developed all over the countryside. And the result is that if we now see these snails, we know they must be medieval or later. I use the word medieval in the biggest sense. So as I have all of these in my samples, or I have them in all of my samples, I could then turn and say, I'm wrong. Professor Darble, you're wrong. He must be medieval or later. So we already had a result that was released to the press, so the National Trust could actually announce that. It went out globally across all the networks and Smithsonian and so forth. But that didn't really help us, because what we really wanted was the science, not Mike's quasi guesses. So our OSL results, here we go. The first results. Phil Tom said, I told you so. However, we did start to get dates from these 4 locations. These ones here, right foot, right elbow, on the upslope side of the unit are Norman. Saxon Norman date, 700 to 1100, 650 to 1310. Phil Tom said, looking at all the statistics, he cannot be earlier than 650 AD, ruling out any prehistoric, any Roman attributes to him, which is about 60% of all the written literature. Hercules out the window. However, it does then mean he predates many of the other things. And he's at a period which no archaeologist had come up and suggested. No archaeologist, as far as I can say, has actually suggested Saxon. Some of the clever historians did, but no archaeologists have bumped into this date. We know that he existed up until, here we have dates up in the hill wash and higher up in the soil, dating to 1250 AD. And we can therefore say at this date, he exists, but he's in a period when the hill wash is building up against him and soils are building up against him. So there, we've dated the giant. But that's a huge conundrum. If he dates to essentially the 10th century, where did he disappear for several hundred years? The first record we now have of him is 1760s. First documentary drawings of him in the 1800s. So where's he gone for several hundred years? Can't have been ignored just because he was rude. But the other thing to say was, when we did look at the records, the abbey was established in 987 AD, slightly coincidental with the dates. So perhaps he is something to do with the establishment of the abbey. Perhaps his arm never had a cloak on it. Perhaps he is literally showing the way to the abbey to everyone in the landscape. So who was the giant? If he's clearly not Cromwell, which would please Brian Edwards. Lots of written records suggest he's Thomas Overy's ghost. Clearly not. Hercules with a coke, possibly, but probably not. But perhaps the Saxon god Helith. So he may be either the Saxon god Helith or he's relating to the first abbot of the priory. But where did he go for 700 years? Why did he disappear? No other monument we know of has so visibly and specifically disappeared from the landscape. And the answer is, of course, in the snails. Because those snails that we took there just to provide the background, here's a boring diagram, you don't have to worry about that, I'm waiting for the National Trust to draw it up for us. Say that after a few decades, he grew over. Can you see this little blob here and that blob there? This is all grassland, but this is where it's shady, and that's shady. This suggests the grasses grew long and the vegetation grew, so the stand height grew to about 60, 70 centimeters. Shrubs will start growing, but also we know that across this chalk face, the bryophytes, the mosses and lichens will start going across it, and he was hidden. He started to disappear. So I thought, okay, that's quite interesting. That's good. That's why I did it. However, his disappearance is a willful act of negligence. It's a willful act of management. It's not just people being lazy and doing. It's just someone positively saying they are not going to bother managing him. He is going to disappear because everyone who manages these figures today says they can only survive through light grazing, but regular management, cutting back the curves, cleaning off the chalk, and doing that. So not to do it is a positive. So at the moment still working in the ecology of that. So the question now is, he was ignored, but why? Deliberate or willful act of neglect. So if he's Saxon, why is the first reference in the 17th century? We have the abbey right next to him, the rude man of Dorset, so forgotten and hidden. And this is what I wrote last time. The snails might provide a clue. The snails haven't provided a clue. We have got the results. The results are he's Saxon. No archaeologist thought that. I didn't. I was as surprised as anyone. Chalk figures as a whole do not belong to a chronological class of monument. Yet in several archaeological textbooks or several books on landscapes, you will see chalk figures all clumped together. Yet we know that the badges at Fovens and some of the white horses date to specific times. The Anzac badge outside my own village at Codford is a First World War badge. So we know they date. So why have archaeologists insisted in, I think I can quote, 7 books where they put all the chalk figures together as if they belong to a single chronological class of monument? They all may belong to the same class of monument, but I'll debate that, but not chronologically. And the naked figure would not have been a shock to early historic communities, or even to the Abbey, to Victorian prudishness. Most people wouldn't be surprised in prehistory, certainly, and in early history, to have seen naked people in the streets. So it's not that he was a shocking member of society. He was willfully forgotten and not managed and grown over. Or is this just a cock and bull story? And is that the end of the story? Well, apart from the publication, I've actually applied for research to do something else. Because we've dated him, but if we look carefully, what have we dated? We've dated his feet. We've dated his elbow. You know we're going. So is the whole figure a single construct? Or elements added later, which is not uncommon for figures to be defaced and a cock and balls to be added. So perhaps we need a little circumcision or an incision across his member to see whether he was like this and this was a later addition. After all, this is, if you look on the Long Manor Wilmington site, you can see he too had a later addition. The other suggestions are, this is something that the Bournemouth University did. They put a nice young woman coming on to that, maybe why it's more exciting. My suggestion to the National Trust is that the land opposite should have perhaps this figure on it, which would explain everything. Thank you. Thank you.
It's fascinating. Has anybody got any questions, please?
You mentioned Wilmington. You're saying that it's not chalk.
No.
Was it lumped with all the? That's one question. Was it lumped with all the other chalk? Because that's one thing.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, forgive my absurd question I'm going to ask, but as I understand it, he only appears as a proper sort of image if he's viewed from up in the air.
Who? Which one?
The Old Man of Wilmington.
Old Man of Wilmington.
Yes.
Yes. No, that's not true, because if you see him from the road, he looks fine. He looks slightly elongated. He looks slightly better from above, which then does beg the question if he's built in the time before flight.
Yeah.
Why he's done that. But he does. But if you look at him from the road, he's more or less okay. He's slightly elongated.
Yes.
But yeah.
But it's strange that you would get different sort of visions of it.
And some of the other figures are also elongated or foreshortened, so they have specific aspects to them, and some of those aspects are not earthly. Yeah, you're right.
I find that absolutely amazing. It's made of just blocks. I think.
And with the Wilmington one, I always grew up with the Wilmington figure thinking it was a chalk figure, and I used to visit him and know that he was blocks of concrete or bricks, and yet that's how he was constructed originally. And we can see the excavation done by Eric Holden in 1971 showed that, and then Martin Bell did that in his excavations.
It's interesting that you say it's Saxon, and if you're correct in that, I'm sure it's a good theory. The thing is, it's obviously pagan, and as Christianity, with the closeness of the monastery as well, presumably, have you thought about that? That they may not want a pagan.
Why is he pagan?
It's not. Well, you should say it's Christian.
There are more Christian symbols with rude elements than there are pagan. So in that respect, he'd fit more happily into a Christian iconography than he would a pagan iconography. If we look at it, the date, yes, okay, he is pre-Christian, so he could be considered to be pagan. However, the monastery was established in 987 at almost exactly the time within decades that he was established. So my supposition is the fact that the date of 987 comes up as the date of the establishment of the abbey, and one of our OSL dates is 980. That, I think that coincidence is rather striking, and I would now strongly suggest that the abbey and the monks, the Benedictine monks, may have had something to do with portraying Cerne
Maybe
Abbas
the
Giant.
Norman Christians, I don't know enough
Yeah,
about it.
yeah.
But at the other end of the scale, maybe the Reformation kind of, I don't know how it was rediscovered, but maybe at the Reformation time, maybe that.
Yeah, we think he might have been rediscovered, and we're still working on this with the historian, in the 1670s date, which is when the church warden said that he had to pay an absorbent amount of money to have him cleared. So someone knew that he existed. Someone could vaguely see an outline, and he was recut. So that might have been the late 17th century. Why that was, we don't know. Or maybe he existed before that, but no one had documented. We don't know. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Another question in the middle.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you about the recutting.
Right.
We stand a better chance of actually dating that possibly than the original.
Yeah, we need to go back and have some more samples from the chalking layers. The chalking layers didn't date very well. That's why the first date came up with 0. And I have talked to Phil Thomas about going back and doing the thing across his member. Phil is sort of says that although the dates cost or did charge the National Trust £1,600 for 2 of them and free for the others, he said that in real terms the amount of man hours it took to do it was about 5 times that. So, which then makes them uneconomic. But yes, I think we should forget about the cost. It should be the academic questions we should be going for. And I think that some of those questions that you're answering may come up from the historians. And the historian we've had working for us at the moment is a brilliant historian and a personal friend, and hasn't actually yet been employed to do that work. So I'm hoping the National Trust will now decide that the historical element is something they need to do, and they will actually have a proper programme and engage him to do some of that historical work. We know that there's another excavation at Cerne going to be happening this summer at the Abbey, and that team are doing some historical work, and so we might get them to combine work. But I think that some of that may be in the history books and not the archaeological record.